Good to be with you again as we continue our sermon series looking at Mark's Gospel. Now, when I was younger, we used to take our family holidays at the beach, and at this beach there was a fish and chip shop where sometimes we would get dinner. I remember on one occasion, my father, as we were eating the evening meal, looked up from his fish and chips and he exclaimed, "That fish and chip shop has changed hands." I wonder whether you've ever had that experience of a favourite takeaway place of yours going down the gurgle hole because of a change in management. There was a local scandal in the suburb where I live when the chef at the bistro at our local club left his job. The food went downhill, the locals kicked up the stink, and so the chef was brought back and everyone was celebrating because the food once more was of an acceptable standard. These are the things that keep us interested in our little corner of suburban Sydney. Of course, sometimes changing hands is a good thing. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple Computers, that's when the company really took off. So a change of management, it's a big deal. Sometimes it can make a very good difference, but other times not so much. What we see today in Mark's Gospel is a section where, in effect, Jesus is putting up a sign which says, under new management, he's offering himself to be the one to lead men and women as they go about their daily lives, as they think about the big questions of life. He's offering himself as an alternative leader to some of the other options that are out there. It may be that your own attempts at finding a guide have left you somewhat disappointed, maybe disillusioned. Maybe you've tried to lead yourself and the results have not been what you would ordinarily hope for. This passage in Mark presents an opportunity for us to snatch a glimpse of the path that Jesus offers to lead us down, to get a taste of the kind of leadership that's on offer with Jesus of Nazareth. We learnt earlier on in the Gospel, right at the very beginning of Mark chapter 1, that this is a gospel of good news that the Messiah has arrived. Messiah, of course, means the anointed king, God's anointed king. And what we learn today are some reasons why this really is good news, that in Jesus we have a leader, a Lord, a master, a director who offers us something that perhaps we can't get anywhere else. So we pick things up in Mark chapter 2, verse 18, where we read that John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Fasting is a bit of an unusual topic in the Bible because it's mentioned plenty of times, but it's never explained to the depths that perhaps we might like to see it explained. It's an action that's always associated with prayer, and it seems to be a method of expressing the emotions of sorrow and mourning during prayer. So fasting might accompany prayers where sins are confessed, or perhaps where laments are offered up to God, laments of mourning and of grief. There were some prescribed fasts in the Old Testament, the Day of Atonement was one of them, that the Jews were expected to carry out. But in Jesus' day, many of the Jews had decided that they were going to fast more often as a sign of devotion to God and as a sign that they were truly sorry for their sins. Fasting was a regular part of their weekly activities, in fact, twice a week for the Pharisees. Jesus didn't have a problem with people fasting. And certainly in the New Testament, it's spoken of in quite a positive way. But people were wondering why Jesus wasn't joining in at this point. Well, his answer is there for us in verse 19. How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. Jesus responds by saying, well, this is actually a time of celebration rather than sorrow. So it's a time for feasting rather than fasting, because it's as if there's a wedding taking place. Now, weddings really are times of feasting rather than fasting, aren't they? I remember at our wedding we had fantastic food, but I have been to some receptions where the food has been less than stellar. In fact, I remember one reception where the food was so long in coming that the guests started to order their own meals from the pub downstairs. Slim Dusty once sang about a pub with no beer. Well, a reception with no food is just as lonesome, morbid and drear, let me tell you. We're at a wedding, Jesus is saying. So no fasting, feasting, that's what we're on about. But what is this wedding that Jesus is talking about? Well, it's a wedding where he himself is the bridegroom. A happy celebration where the attention is falling upon him. Now, elsewhere in the New Testament, we will see that the true wedding is between Jesus, the bridegroom, and the church, his bride, God's people being joined together with Jesus as their husband. But at this stage, the idea is that Jesus is shining a light upon himself. His presence there among the disciples is a cause of great happiness. Just like when you're in the presence of a happy bridal party, it's a time of great celebration. That Jesus has arrived here is a time of great joy. The reason we can be joyful is that Jesus is starting something new. From verse 21, we have two small illustrations about the new mixing with the old. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, Jesus says, otherwise the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. We've all had that experience of a new shirt when, after it's first washed and dried, is no longer the roomy garment that we thought it was. New textiles can shrink, and if they're placed on an old piece of cloth, as that new piece of cloth contracts, it will tear the old piece of cloth, making the original whole much, much worse. Jesus is saying that the new doesn't always mix with the old. Likewise, he continues, no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. Some of you may have experience brewing your own beer, and you know, if you make your own alcohol, you're working with some live biology. Gases are produced which can build up over time. Now, obviously, Jesus had observed the winemakers of his day, and he knew that old and brittle wineskins could sometimes not withstand the pressure that came with the fermentation process of new wine. And so you put new wine into old wineskins, and sometimes there'd be an explosion. What point is Jesus making with these illustrations? Well, here's the point. Sometimes the new doesn't mix with the old. And sometimes the old needs to give way for the new. I love history. I love old things. I find it very hard to throw things out, but sometimes I am forced to admit that the new is better than the old. What Jesus is saying is that he is the new provider of direction and leadership. He is the new chief when it comes to matters of life and faith. He's also saying that his way is better. Better than the way of John the Baptist, better than the way of the Pharisees. He's even saying, we'll see a bit more of this in a moment, he's even saying that his way is better than that of the Old Testament. This is why his arrival is good news and it's worth celebrating. Now, in what ways is the leadership that Jesus offers, in what ways is that leadership better? Well, we have two more sections in our reading and we see a reason in each of them. First of all, Jesus leads with mercy instead of oppression. It's the first reason why his leadership is better. Mercy instead of oppression. We all know that there are some leaders who seek to lead us and would do so with very oppressive means. Jesus is not that kind of leader. Let's see why that is the case. After passing on the fast that was being practiced by John and the Pharisees, Jesus overlooks another Jewish practice. We see this in verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" It was true that working on the Sabbath was forbidden, and here is Jesus breaking the Sabbath laws. Or was he? I think there could be an argument to say that picking out a few heads of grain while you're out walking is hardly breaking the rules that were laid down about the Sabbath. I mean, the idea about the Sabbath, it was a rest from your usual occupation. And in a field, that meant it was a rest from the work of sowing a field of grain, or harvesting a whole field of grain, or working your animals up and down the field. Picking a few heads of grain while you're out on a walk is hardly breaking the rule as it was intended. It was a rule to rest from the agricultural business. But yet, the Pharisees see what Jesus and the disciples are doing, and their alarm bells are going off. Now, why is that the case? Well, as I mentioned last week, the Pharisees were desperate to make sure that they were following all the rules of the Old Testament. In fact, some of them believed that if all Israel were to follow the Old Testament perfectly, even for just a short time, that's when the Messiah would come. So they were very keen to follow everything as closely as they could, and they were very keen to encourage others to do the same. Now, one method of encouraging others to do the same was to take a very, very strict reading of the Old Testament law so that no one came anywhere close to breaking it. It's a bit like the police issuing tickets to families going on a drive during the COVID lockdown. Did you hear news of that a few weeks ago? I mean, yes, large gatherings ought to be policed, but a family going on a drive? Really? Sometimes the law can be enforced in an overzealous manner, and that's what we get with the Pharisees in the first century. But Jesus comes along, and he decides he's going to take a stand against this oppressive regime. His interpretation is that the law was never meant to be used in that way. He even has a precedent that he appeals to in verse 25. "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Jesus is referring to a story in 1 Samuel chapter 21, where David is on the run for his life. He's learnt from his friend Jonathan that King Saul was out to kill him. And so it's a desperate situation David finds himself in, a life and death situation. And so surely in that situation, the local laws can bend a little bit. I remember a friend of mine was once hosting a dinner party when a guest suddenly had an allergic reaction to some of the food that was being served. Maybe this is worse than a reception with no food. It's a dinner party with anaphylaxis. Maybe that is worse. Anyway, things were looking grim for this guest, and so they bundled her into a car, and my friend tells me that he broke every speed limit and ran every red light between his house in Toongabbie and Westmead Hospital. Laws are meant to protect life, which is why ordinarily we submit ourselves to them. But sometimes the protection of life means that laws might be broken. God's law was never meant to be so forcibly enacted that it became oppressive to the people it was designed to serve. And so Jesus says to the Pharisees in verse 27, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." He's correcting the path laid out by the Pharisees, a path which took the laws of God and turned them into something oppressive. Then Jesus crowns this interaction with another statement in verse 28. "So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Son of Man is a title that Jesus would use of himself. And here Jesus seems to be saying that not only is he superseding the way of the Pharisees, but that even the law of the Old Testament must give way to the new path that he is initiating. As Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus is master even over the Old Testament statutes in their unadulterated form. We often hear the phrase, no one is above the law. Well, Jesus says that he is the one individual who can determine when God's law is enforced and when it can be put aside. In Mark's story, it remains to be seen just in which ways Jesus will maintain the old law and put it to one side. But by the time we're through today, we will catch a glimpse of how Jesus will change things. Right now, however, I think an appropriate question at this point is to ask this. Which master are we living to please? Whose path are we being led down? Perhaps you're following a master not unlike the Pharisees, a master who asks you to oblige with certain behaviours and certain achievements that you must tick off like you're ticking off a list. Sometimes this master comes clothed in a religious skin, fast at this time, worship at this place, pray for this many hours, in this manner, in this way. Often with these types of achievement-orientated masters, we are left with the question, have I done enough to please them? Would I ever do enough to please them? These masters don't often offer their subjects true peace of mind. Sometimes the master is more secular, but no less dominant. The master of pleasing our peers and pleasing our neighbours. The master of physical appearance. The master of personal achievement. The master of gaining enough wealth to satisfy what it is we think we need. All of these masters offer the promise of freedom and happiness, but it's so often the case that they just become a ball and chain around the ankle. Sometimes even those who know Jesus as their master can find themselves dominated by another Lord, which kind of comes close to Jesus being a master, but in essence is a different master altogether. The master of Christian service, doing all those things to serve people in the church and to serve one another. I mean, service is a good idea, but it itself is not our master. Sometimes Christians can feel their faith is failing to produce joy and peace, and I wonder whether one question to ask in that situation is whether we're still seeking joy from other masters, masters who are never going to deliver in the end. Think for a moment about the masters that you are serving in your life. Are they really granting you true peace of mind? Jesus comes as a Lord who isn't interested in oppression. I'm not saying that gives us permission to do whatever it is that we want, because he is still a Lord after all. But he is a Lord and Master who leads us with mercy and not as a tyrant. Second reason Jesus is the better director, and we'll look at this just quickly, is that he brings life in the place of death. We see this in the final section of our reading today. Chapter 3 begins with another episode on the Sabbath when Jesus heals a man with a dried up and paralysed, shriveled hand. Once more, the oppressive interpretation of the law by the Pharisees is put on display. We're told in verse 2 that they're looking to bust Jesus for healing someone on the Sabbath. No matter how wonderful the opportunity to bring life, the Pharisees would deny that opportunity for the sake of their rigid interpretation of the law. And once more, Jesus corrects their cruel interpretation of the Sabbath. Verse 4, which is lawful on the Sabbath, he asks, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Can you just imagine this scene in your mind for just a moment? A shriveled and unusable hand, in many respects a dead hand, suddenly stretched out in strength and vitality. It's a little picture of Jesus bringing life out of death. I say a little picture because Jesus offers so much more to those people who put their trust in him. We read in verse 6 of chapter 3, that the Pharisees went out and began to plot how they might kill Jesus. The Pharisees will be successful in that plotting, and it will be that very death that will provide the atonement for sins that will enable us to enjoy eternal life. It's with great irony that the killing of Jesus would do away with many of the laws that the Pharisees were so keen to protect. They thought they were protecting their religious system by killing Jesus, when in actual fact, that was the killer blow to the system that they were so intent on putting in place. The true path towards what it is that they are after, the path to a true eternal Sabbath, will be brought about by men and women trusting in the death of Jesus and not in a religious system, be it there in the scriptures or be it invented by religious men. And so this is why it's worth celebrating the arrival of Jesus the bridegroom, because he arrives as a master who serves before he demands, as a master who gives so much to those who look to him as their Lord. So friends, the final question: how well is your master serving you? Are the masters that you serve leaving you with a sense of life and peace and joy? Or are they locking you down with obligations that you will never be able to meet? Maybe it's time for you to meet your new master. Amen.